Chapter 5, I for Isobel. Now, we know the significance of that title now, yeah? Now, there is a significant time jump between this chapter and the last chapter, and I say significant not necessarily because a lot of time has passed, but more so because a lot has changed. In fact, reading this chapter for the first time, Isobel was basically unrecognizable. She's completely different. First of all, Isobel awakes in the room of a man, Michael, with whom she has had a one-night stand. Now, as she wakes, she also looks at the ceiling, and her description of the ceiling is not as eloquent as her past descriptions have been in the novel. But instead, she says that the shade of the ceiling is paler than pumpkin, darker than pea. Now, similarly, she says it's a stain-colored stain, and shut up. Like, her general syntax is comparatively quite incompetent and messy, but what this does is it highlights how far she's fallen, how far she has strayed from her passion for description, for writing, and this is because, at this point, she doesn't know that this is her passion. Now, she even thinks there are words we have plenty of, nasty little buzzing insects that they are. So even her relationships with words, with language, which historically she has loved, that's a relationship that is considerably more deteriorated at this point in Isobel's life. Now, Isobel also mentions the word factory, which she describes as a sickness. Now, she role-plays in her head and says, "Doctor, I have a problem. Some people count lampposts. I describe them." So the word factory is literally a voice in her head that churns out descriptions of everything she sees. It's a compulsion of hers. Now, whether or not this word factory is an evolution of the idiot in the attic, that is unclear. Some people would probably say that there's no parallel there. However, it's my interpretation that that might be the case. Now, Isobel's circumstances are not revealed right away. All we know is that she's been kicked out of a former residence by someone called Kate. Part of this tension between them is due to the superior look that Isobel apparently has on her face in the presence of Kate. And apparently Kate says to Isobel, "You only come here anyhow to see what you can pick up." Now, interestingly, Isobel says of Kate's place that, as for picking people up, that was why quite a few people went to Kate's. Similarly, Isobel says, the remark about picking people up must have sent this Michael after her to wander about the streets. Wander about the streets. Now, it seems that Isobel is a prostitute now, and that Kate's house is a whore house? Is that right? Or do I just have a messed up mind? Seriously, I'm trying to figure that one out. I probably have a dirty mind. It's probably something else. Make of that what you will. Anyway, Isobel wakes up and she peruses through Michael's books, but she's butt naked while she's doing this, which, I don't know, also kind of nods toward my previous argument that I was mentioning before. Also, don't forget that this was a one-night stand, and that Michael says, "I wouldn't have taken you for a bookish type." I mean, okay, in isolation, none of these things, there's nothing inherently suggesting prostitution or anything like that. But together, I don't know, they make a picture, yeah? They make a picture. If you're watching this, you're either thinking one of two things, which is like, oh, wow, you're right, maybe she is a prostitute. Or you're one of those people thinking, you're crazy, this not a prostitute, hurry up and move on. Anyway, when Michael asks her about girls like you, I wonder why you do things like this, Isobel contemplates a deeper reason that is wordless, but she calls it inertia, which is basically a state of inactivity, where everything has just stopped. Not very difficult to figure that one out. Now anyway, Isobel ends up offending Michael, and so he wants her out. She decides that she's going to steal one of his books though, so while he is taking a shower, she sneaks one of his books into her bag, and then she runs off. Funnily enough, the name of the book is Words of the Saints. Now after she leaves, Isobel is out in the street and she sees a telephone box, which prompts the memory of how she used to collect pennies and use them to call people and abuse them. Now apparently she was a phone freak, and when she found a new victim on the other side of the phone line, she would let out a stream of hatred. That is, until one particular listener said, "What an unhappy person you must be," which made Isobel feel ashamed. It wasn't until another listener broke down crying that Isobel apologized and gave up on her dirty little game. Now, Isobel feels the urge to return to the telephone booth, but then she whips out her stolen book, which somehow gives her the power to resist. Now, eventually, Isobel returns home, which apparently is a rooming house. Isobel's room is a mess, which makes her reflect that squalor within demanded squalor without, which basically means that if you're miserable on the inside, then so too must you look miserable on the outside. Haha, which is the implication of her messy room. Now ultimately, we're not given any reason to think that Isobel is in a good place at the moment. She's a bit aimless, our Isobel, and it's even said she wanted a cause to live for, but could not adopt one. The cause would have to find her. Lazy. Now Isobel sees that there's a flap of wallpaper hanging loose, which prompts her to repair it by sewing together a panel of embroidery. Now first though, Isobel is revisited by a memory of sewing in school and how she stitched a rose on a piece of cloth, but her sewing teacher, Miss Harmon, mocked it in front of the entire class, even calling her a stupid girl. Like Jesus, was everyone this horrible to Isobel? Or is she simply just demonizing all these people in her memory? Anyway, this experience was what put Isobel off embroidery for life. However, Isobel also realizes that Miss Harmon isn't around anymore, so there would be no judgment. This was known as freedom. Now, as she begins to go through the motions of sewing, Isobel thinks about the book and why the book she stole seems to give her a sense of peace. Now, at first, she thinks it might be religion, but ultimately she realizes that the book meant friendship, company at least, communication and understanding. She's finally catching up with what we already know. Now finally, Isobel opens the book again, Words of the Saints, and she reads a passage about mortifying one's desire for honor, which evidently comprises of doing things that make people hate you, and also thinking poorly of yourself, and making sure that others think poorly of you as well. Seems legit. She turns to another passage about death, which reminds her not just of Nick, but of how most people responded to Nick's death, which was generally to show compassion. Now at this point, Isobel returns to her sewing, but she knows what she must do. Apparently, in order to discover the true meaning of the book, Isobel decides that she must return home, as in home, as in where she lived with her family. Now the next day, before Isobel takes off, she acknowledges that while she hasn't finished sewing, and while it won't cover up the loose flap in the wall, she still appreciates that through sewing she found a small, authentic piece of her lost self. And this is very much the intention of her trip home as well. She says it's to find out the meaning of the stolen book, but really she's in search of her own identity, to go back to her roots and find some kind of clarity about who she is. Now anyway, Isobel takes a bus to her home suburb, and when she gets off, naturally, she's gripping the book for support. She progresses through several familiar scenes, all of which incite various memories. These scenes include the church, the school, and the playground. Now in this last one, the playground, Isobel recalls a memory of almost being bullied, which prompts the thought that in true memory, you don't see yourself. All the miserable self-images were invention, or at least embroidery. Now in my eyes, that links back to the idea that Isobel could be considered a masochist, because the miserable self-images, the self-deprecation, the suffering that she endures, that is all invention. It's fiction created by herself for no other purpose than to harm herself, because being harmed is all she's ever known. Now, it is only when Isobel passes by the church again that she remembers a sermon about the cobwebbed cell of the soul, given by a young priest who seemed, at the time, to be looking right into Isobel and accepting what he saw. Now, this is when Isobel finds some clarity, because it's here that it all came now. The calm elation, the sense of everything solved, of peace. Now, this clarity is that what always brought her peace in the past was religion. And the reason the book brought on a similar calmness is because the word saints on the cover was an association with religion. That's a bit anticlimactic if you ask me. Even Isobel, when she realizes this, thinks it was religion, after all. How sad. So even she's a bit unimpressed, methinks. Finally, Isobel makes her way to her old home, but she is approached by an old neighbor, Mrs. Adams. Now at first, Isobel panics because evidently, based on the way her parents had conditioned her to view Mrs. Adams, Isobel views Mrs. Adams as Mrs. Adams the boogeyman, boogie woman. Now this is also because when she was 9 years old, Isobel wrote a poem about Mrs. Adams and her cat, Smoke, which was published in the local paper. And because she put Mrs. Adams' name in the paper, apparently this meant that Mrs. Adams was pissed. Mrs. Adams, however, is very friendly and invites Isobel inside for a cup of tea. Isobel is nervous, but she agrees. Inside, Mrs. Adams shows Isobel the poem that Isobel wrote when she was 9 years old, and she says how much that she appreciated the poem. She didn't hate it at all. Seeing the poem, Isobel thinks there's a rider in there, Isobel, a naked infant greased and trussed in the baking dish with an apple jammed in its mouth. Now this analogy might seem a bit weird, but it links back to that story that Mrs. Prendergast told of the baby that was greased up and put in the oven by the whack job mother. And so the imagery used here suggests a similar oppression endured by Isobel. Isobel's literary voice, her creative flair, her talent for writing that was oppressed by her mother. Her writing ability is characterized as an infant, greased up on a baking tray, ready to be devoured. Now, Mrs. Adams continues to praise the poem and explains that she wanted to gift Isobel with a book so that she could keep writing. But Isobel's mother, May, always refused it. And every time Mrs. Adams approached Isobel as a child, she obviously fled because her parents led her to believe that she was deranged. Now, Isobel realizes that this makes sense, because given the treatment that she endured, her parents would not have wanted a writer around, a witness, a recorder. Now, anyway, the reason why Mrs. Adams loves the poem so much is because it brings back memories of her cat, which she loved so much. So she's a crazy cat lady. Now, anyway, this makes Isobel become unhinged. She leaves Mrs. Adams in a hurry, coming to pieces in great slabs, in chunks, like an iceberg breaking up. When she's finally outside, Isobel realizes the extent to which her parents lied to her in her youth. Mrs. Adams was just an example, but so too did they quash her passion for writing, which is ultimately the pillar of Isobel's identity. She thinks of her parents now as cruel, deceitful bastards and spiteful, tormenting bastards. Now, Isobel finds a rock to crouch by, and she cries. She cries a roaring flood that drowned thought. And this is where it all comes out. Now, finally, when she comes to, she thinks, I am a writer, I am a writer. This is the identity for which Isobel has been searching. She also realizes that it meant giving in to the word factory. That is the voice in her head that has that compulsion for description and, I guess, storytelling. Now, she also suggests that the word factory and the idiot in the attic too, if we're indeed thinking that that is a baser version of the word factory, she suggests that the reason it has been bugging her all these years is because it was the poor little bugger trying to get out of the baking dish. So that imagery is being used again. Isobel was suppressing it. She was suppressing that desire to write, and that was the catalyst that fractured her identity in two, put her identity in a state of flux where she didn't really know who she was. She was trying to reconcile between these dual identities, Isobel the writer, and then Isobel, the daughter of May Callahan, who was the born liar and had all of these insecurities and doubts about herself. Now, realizing this, Isobel makes her way to the corner shop where she buys an exercise book to write in, and even though she's disheveled from crying, Isobel describes the moment as the happiest moment of my life, because she knows who she is now. She finally knows what it is that she was missing and what she was blind to all this time. When Isobel returns home, she opens the book and she starts writing. She writes a hypothetical scene between Michael and a male friend with whom he discusses the morning after his one-night stand with Isobel, laughing about how she was naked and reading his books. And then after he showered, she was gone and took the book with her. Now, it is at this point that Isobel knows she must return the book to Michael. Now, the final scene of the text is Isobel going into work. She reflects on how over the weekend she met the ghosts of two murderers, which is an allusion to her parents, as well as the semi-strangled body of an infant learning to walk, which is an allusion to herself, or specifically the part of her that had been suppressed all her life, the writer. Now, she enters the office with such notable happiness that Rita thinks that Isobel has met someone. Our story ends with Isobel thinking with joy that, yes, I met someone. And that someone is herself. Yeah. We made it, guys! Sweet baby Jesus. Those videos are the equivalent to 23 pages. You're welcome. Now, I hope that gives you a clear understanding of the story, because there was quite a bit of analysis included there. Obviously, there is a ton more that you can do, but hopefully I covered the big areas for you. Definitely don't shy away from analyzing more. There's still plenty more. Anyway, thanks for watching, ladies and gents, and I will see you next time. Best of luck. So wait. At the end of the book there, when Isobel goes into work, it's Rita that thinks Isobel has met someone. But last we heard, literally like half the book ago, Rita was engaged and planning on moving to Melbourne, and Isobel was going to take her job. That's awkward. That's awkward. That's awkward. Awkward. Awkward.